brothers and sisters. It's really a great privilege to be able to participate through the media of video to this day of thinking and sharing about the situation of our churches in the pandemic. I'd like to thank Tom Verdreen specifically for allowing me to be able to share a few thoughts about the situation of our churches, specifically in France. I'm speaking to you from Montpellier, where I live. And most of our churches are in the area of south of France. And these areas specifically have been impacted by the COVID situation. We were, all of us, of course, in quarantine the last month of March for about 2 months and a half. Our churches weren't able to function during this time, but ever since they have mostly and generally, and I think we can say that also of all churches in France, gone back to doing their services on a weekly basis and also other meetings. If they respect specifically a very strict COVID protocol of social distancing, but also wearing masks during the whole time of the service. We are quite, I think as everyone is today, quite worried about where the situation could lead us. Most of our churches are in what we call red regions, in which the circulation of the virus is very high. And so we're expecting different measures to be taken by local authorities, but also the French government in the weeks and the days to come that could affect and are already affecting our capacity to meet on a regular basis. This situation, I think, is really opened the box for thinking on the church and its mission and its future for me, but for probably the vast majority of you also, and probably worldwide also. And so what I wanted to do now is just share with you a few of these thoughts and in the way they relate to the churches, the situation of the churches in France. And what I've done is resume my thinking in 6 main words that I'd like to share with you. I think for me personally, the most difficult part of the situation of the pandemic has been the necessity to change. Of course, I think our churches have been adapting to the major change of civilizations that we've been going through in the last 50 or 80 years. But the changes that are brought upon with the pandemic are really so close-knit, so short in time that it really brings a big tension. And it's the way, I think, that we are going to be able to look at these changes is the post-quarantine area, the post-COVID time for the church. Is it going to be really a time for extraordinary experimentation and innovation for our churches? I think it's an important question that we have in front of us. When a missionary leaves out for a country, he knows pretty much where he's going. There's a lot of uncertainty. But do we know where we're going? I think that's probably the most difficult question. There's so many unknowns in front of us, but I think it's really an occasion of depending on the Lord in a new way. I also believe that we're not going back. I think that the situation of the pandemic and the COVID has really brought upon maybe a new era. Interestingly, there was a French journalist recently that was arguing that our era started with the 11th of September 2001 with the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers. And he was speaking of the era of terrorism. He was speaking of era of uncertainty, era of deep social divides, of political populism, and now maybe the era of COVID or different worldwide pandemics that are going to be coming as we are more and more in this world. What is true, I think, is that our churches can no longer minister effectively using methods for a world that no longer exists. And in that way, I think there's a really necessity to adapt. In the last month of May, there was a meeting between responsible people for different churches making a first analysis about the situation of COVID and the influence on the French churches. This meeting brought together people from the evangelical worlds, Pentecostal worlds, Baptist, Reformed and Lutheran, and even Catholic circles. And interestingly, they had 3 factors that they put in front, saying that these factors were determining and will be determining for churches who want to survive in the pandemic situation. And they worded them like this: churches who will not survive in this crisis are churches who are disconnected with the digital world, churches who are disconnected with their social need, with the social need of their neighborhoods, and thirdly, churches who are not shaped by their sense of mission, but shaped their missions to their needs. Of course, here in France, as we can see in so many other countries, and it's probably worldwide also, we have seen a major drop in attendance since the time of the quarantine. I don't know if you're familiar with the different studies that have been done by the Barna Group in America that say that 1 out of 3 members of the churches haven't returned yet. Some studies, recent studies in the Catholic circles, have showed that maybe in France the percentage is even a bit more higher. And this of course opens to so many different questions. The reasons why people are not coming, it's because of the fear of COVID. Some of them also can't stand wearing the masks. One of the requirements that we had in France was that you had to reserve your place in advance. And some people refused to do that, or some of them were evoking also the fact of being able to follow the services through online. And there's a reflection on the ability to cross all this from churches who are relying massively on the more elderly people, both financially but also for the services. There's a big question there. Maybe there's a question also about the size of communities. Are we coming to the end of the mega church or larger church era, in which we find that we need a mega church needs to really split up in very small different groups of people who are more closely linked? It's a real question. Maybe the underlying question is that are smaller churches, smaller church units, more adapted for the future of what's coming? Smaller services with smaller people and smaller communities. American author Thom Rainer just put out a book on the post-quarantine church and the different issues that it is bringing up. And interestingly enough, one of the points that he says is most important is the building and the use of the building. In this post-COVID context. The thinking is that how are we going to use and rethink our buildings in this new context to really express our sense of mission and reaching out to the community around us. For him, the fact that a missions church project is inwardly looking it reflects in the way that the building is being used. Is the building used only for our own purposes and our own needs, or is it really being put out there for the needs of the community around the church? And it's this connection between the local church and the needs around it that is really important, and I think can also make a difference. And I'm seeing this really work also in France. There's a big issue there. It's a big issue with the historical temples that we have. And how can they be set to use? It's an issue with the smaller churches and different types of buildings. But the question is the same. How are we going to put these buildings to the use of the others? Interestingly enough, there's another author, Jeff Fountain, director of the Schumann Center for European Studies, that coins it like this: do we practice church-shaped mission or mission-shaped church? Of course, one of the most crucial areas is the area of giving. I've been quite amazed to see that in the last months in our union of churches, the giving hasn't dropped much. This is probably because of the organization of our smaller churches, like we have said, whose members actually support the church on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, by using electronic means, by transfer of money into the account of the church. And so what we're seeing is that something that's pretty much stable as long as it lasts. Because if we go into an economic recession, if the natural reflex of saving money also is really weighs in with the giving to the church, we might be in a different situation. But what we're seeing is that this is really crucial, the way that it's organized, and that maybe some other churches, the giving is linked to what happens on Sunday morning, the effective presence of people who give there and while they are in church. Well, that model maybe is in difficulty for the future. And so there's a whole, I think, also a reflection on our teaching on giving, the way we organize the giving in the churches, that's going to open up, I think, in the years to come. Interestingly enough, I was reading an article from a journalist in a Paris Reformed Press, who was saying that he was seeing in his local church, but also in all the churches in the Paris region, a big drop, a massive drop in the gifts. But on the same time, the necessity to really spend money and social accompaniment of people, and that most of the money that the church had saved in the last 10 years is now gone because they've had to support different people of the church. And this is what he says in his article. Behind the reality of the numbers, the usual balances of the community are being upset and are imposing a clarification of our theological choices. To what extent can we help? Should we set priorities when it comes to misery? Is there a possible balance between the spiritual life of the community and its involvement in the world? Should the local church be subject to budgetary imperatives, or are other forms of witness possible? Such weighty questions will be difficult to resolve at the level of the local congregation alone. Perhaps that is fortunate. Other changes that we've had to make is the one pertaining to internet and to online services. Nobody told me in seminary that I had also to be a cameraman and imagine the way that I could film myself on internet. It hasn't been easy at all for pastors, but I think this transition that would have taken years to come is in a way a blessing. We've had to adapt really quickly, and I think there's no coming back on this. But of course that opens to all different types of questions. What does it really mean to be able to make disciples through internet? We're tempted to really hold on to our old model by saying, well, it's the community is the place in which we nurture people towards faith, and I think that will never change. That's the way that Jesus instituted the church. We need a sense of belonging to a family and belonging to a body, and the body of Christ, of course. But maybe we should be realizing the issue of people who will start learning about the faith. It's already happening really through internet only. I don't think that these types of relationships are wrong relationships or bad relationships. I think people today and in the future will go to internet massively for stretching their knowledge, and we need to be present there. I even think that we need to have minister titles with digital added on it, digital pastors or digital, I don't know what that looks like, and it seems like a crazy idea, but tomorrow I think it's going to be more of an issue. The most important lesson that we have learned collectively as the French people, as many others also, I think, is the idea that we are vulnerable again. Learning that in a very concrete way. But of course, this has wakened up in so many people the idea of their fragility. We're seeing people in our own churches very fragile in front of the idea of sickness. We're seeing mental illnesses also coming in different types of people. We're seeing in our neighborhoods people struggling with this whole situation, and it might get worse and worse as things go on and things get more difficult. And so I think really that the church is a place that really needs to rethink in that way, with that scope and that idea. What does it look like to care today for our own parishioners, our own people who are on the walk of faith, standing in peace, standing firm in Christ in a world that's in crisis? What does it look like to be able to share that around us? The idea of the gathered church and the scattered church is I think is really in the center of our thinking, and in the center of the way we should look at things. And of course, this goes with prayer. For example, in our church, we've set up a program of teaching people what it is to pray for their neighbors in their neighborhood, what it is to be yourself anchored in the peace that Christ brings, but bringing it also to other people in the name of the gospel. Thank you for listening. There were so many other ideas I wanted to share with you. This is a great time for sharing. I thank again the GZB for all the stimulation that it's giving, the opportunity to share these words. May God bless you in your different situations. We share this common hope, this common faith that the Lord is the Lord of the church in time of COVID.